This in itself is a small step, but it's another step on the road to ruination of our political system that the Supreme Court is clearly headed down. They wish to dismantle all limits on giving, piece by piece, until we are back to the days of the robber barons, when anyone or anything could give unlimited money, undisclosed, and make our political system seem so rigged that everyone will lose interest in our democracy.
Senator Chuck Schumer, hours after this week's Supreme Court ruling on political donations. And so, Kay, I'll pick it up where Michael Steele kind of left it off, just talking about the idea of disclosure. And we're talking about McCutcheon, but we're also talking about Citizens United. And what we're really just talking about here is just this influx of massive money that's come into the system, and it's only going to accelerate, I think we all expect in the next few years. Given the reality on Capitol Hill right now, where you have Republicans controlling the House, Democrats controlling the Senate, Democrats controlling the White House, is there any kind of consensus that exists or could potentially exist between the parties just on the issue of disclosure to get something through legislatively?
I don't know if you've been paying attention to Capitol Hill.
Nothing changed this week.
No.
Okay.
Nothing changed this week. I mean, yeah, sure.
So
there are the people.
Who's the advantage then? Assuming that's the case, then there's going to be no legislative remedy to any of this. Just what the Supreme Court says kind of goes, and the system's going to develop around that. I assume that means one of the parties thinks it has an advantage with this ruling. Is it the Republicans just don't want to?
I don't think that one side thinks they have an advantage or the other. I do see them hopping immediately into the cash race right now. People heading into the midterms are going to be calling their big donors. They're going to be the committees are going to be getting on the phone. All those people who maxed out. So maybe it's one of those things, well, let's see how much money we can get now, and then maybe we'll suggest disclosure after the election. I don't see it at this point. It's like we're too far down the road, in terms of not having a disclosure to suggest it. People are so scared about the amount of money coming in. I mean, a vulnerable candidate has to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars, and this just means they can go and pick up the phone and raise more. Person with a cash advantage often has the advantage in the election, and so it's hard to want to say, oh, I'm going to give that up, or I'm going to.
And incumbents usually get the cash advantage, and the cash advantage, which one creates the other. But Senator Whitehouse, to bring you back in on this, because we've been talking about, and you were sort of getting at it too a minute ago, potentially that one of the significant pieces about this ruling is it sets up the next ruling, and I think a lot of people are saying, gets to what Clarence Thomas was talking about, where maybe there'll be another case before the court where they'll say, not only can you give to as many campaigns as you want, you can give as much to any campaign as you want. And we had Michael Steele in the last segment basically making the argument, the conservative argument, money is speech. And I wonder, just from a philosophical standpoint, if somebody has $1 billion and they want to give $500,000 to a congressional candidate, it's clearly going to have a huge impact on this race. But why don't they have the constitutional? Why don't they, or shouldn't they have the constitutional right to do that?
Let me start by getting back into the disclosure conversation that you all just had, because although McCutcheon probably falls relatively evenly, or at least it's hard to tell how that falls between the parties, Citizens United clearly was a massive gift to the Republican Party. And it was at that point that the bipartisan issue of disclosure became partisan, and well over a dozen Republican senators who had publicly spoken out in favor of disclosure, written op-eds in favor of disclosure, been really out there on disclosure, backed away and said, who, me? No, we're not going to, and they all voted against my disclosure bill. So that's the problem. It is partisan. It's not because McCutcheon creates it. It's because Citizens United creates it. And I think that we're not going to get a disclosure bill until there's enough Democratic money that it comes more into balance, and the Republicans are no longer seeing the kind of political advantage that induces them to walk away from positions that they had publicly held for years.
So Andy,
and as to the
go ahead.
As to the second question, if you've got a billionaire who wants to give $500 million out, the problem is that there are a lot of other people in this democracy too. And if you end up with a democracy in which the big corporations and the billionaires own all the airwaves, all the messages, and all the candidates, then everybody else is frozen out of it. And so, yeah, the billionaire has a First Amendment right, but the person who doesn't have $1 billion has a First Amendment right, too. And to have their voice so drowned out is something that I think is bad for our democracy and wrong, and constitutionally something that Congress is capable of regulating and should regulate. Indeed, that was the constitutional law of the land until this very activist group of 5 Republican judges overruled all that precedent and decided to open up the floodgates for corporate money.
So Andy, that point that Senator Whitehouse is making about the incentives to get Republicans behind the idea of disclosure, is that really, if Democrats can mobilize, if Democratic billionaires can kind of mobilize, and you have the Democratic equivalent of Sheldon Adelson, does that get a bipartisan consensus for disclosure? Does that create it? Is that what's missing here?
I think it absolutely would help. I mean, I wish that Republicans would see the merits of disclosure on the merits of disclosure and not out of self-preservation. But let's face it, you know,
good luck with that.
All members of Congress care first and foremost about getting reelected, and that's just how it works. And if the Republican side, especially with Mitch McConnell, a fervent opponent of any kind of campaign finance regulation, in charge, you know, Republicans in the Senate and also in the House, they're just not going to see the interest. There's not going to be the push to get behind a disclosed bill. I will say there is one senator who has been somewhat active on this, and that would be Lisa Murkowski. She's been talking with Senator Ron Wyden about some kind of disclosure bill. She's actually, you know, seen the light on it, but there are so many of her fellow Republicans in both chambers who just don't see the upside to it.
That's one, and you need dozens. So we're at the end here. Actually, I want to thank Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for joining us this morning. Really appreciate that, as well as MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele. And another update now on the search for that missing Malaysia Airlines